My name is Corrine Motivans. I'm the assistant to the director here at the National Conservation Training Center. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the first webinar in our series on monarch butterfly conservation. It's brought to you by a partnership between the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the Monarch Joint Venture. And sometimes we shorten Monarch Joint Venture to MJV. MJV was established in 2008 as a partnership focused on monarch conservation, and you'll be hearing a lot more about it from our presenter, Dr. Karen Obenhauser. She is the MJV Steering Committee Chair. We're going to get started. I wanted to let you know that this webinar will be recorded. You can share it with anyone at any time at the link. So just a quick disclaimer, this product today is for educational purposes only. If there are views, opinions, or positions expressed in the webinar, it's those of the guest presenter and do not necessarily reflect the views, opinions, or positions of the Department of Interior or Fish and Wildlife Service. Some of the materials and images may be protected by copyright and may have been licensed by a third party, so they could be restricted in their use. And so with that, I will hand it off to our presenter. Thank you, Karen.
Thanks, Corrine. It's really great to be here. It's humbling to see so many people coming online, and especially so many names that I know and recognize. There are a lot of monarch experts here, so that's going to be a lot of fun. I want to give a little bit of a summary of where I'm going and give a little disclaimer that this is my very first ever webinar, so I feel a little bit like an 18-year-old kid trying to balance a whole bunch of different technology, a phone and a computer and all sorts of little screens, so hopefully I'll do okay. And I also want to say that this presentation is going to cover monarch basics. I'm not going to be talking about cutting-edge research on monarch biology and conservation, although I'd be really excited to get questions about monarch biology and conservation, kind of new directions in that area. I'm also not going to be including details on management strategies. That'll be coming up in future webinars. This is basically just an introduction to monarch biology and conservation. We have a really diverse group of people here, so hopefully there will be something for everybody. And we encourage you to jump in with questions throughout the webinar. So just a little bit about where I'm going today. I'm going to kind of cover 5 key points. First of all, talk a little bit about the very complex and exciting natural history of monarchs, and then spend a fair amount of time talking about relationships between people and monarchs. People are very interested in monarchs, probably more so than any other insect in the world, any other single insect species. So I'm going to give you a few of my thoughts about why that is. Then talk about the fact that despite this interest, monarch numbers are declining and why that's happening, and finally end by talking about what we can do. Now, because you're all sitting there at work or at home in front of your computers, I'm trying to throw in a few things to kind of keep us engaged because I can't see anybody's face, which is kind of odd. So we're going to throw in a few places during this webinar with some fun monarch questions, so little quizzes. So just to get started here, a little bit of time to settle in and test your monarch knowledge with a fun fact. Let's see, I thought we were going to have, do we have a place up, Corrine, where people are going to be able to vote on this? Is that going to come up? Yeah, okay, you should see a poll. And I wanted to give you just a couple seconds here. You can start voting. Is it true or false that monarch larvae liquefy within the pupa and the adult develops from this nutrient-rich soup that's formed from the larval organs? All right, so you can vote here, vote true or false. Oh, good, we have about 50 people have already voted. Okay, I'm going to count down to 0 from 5, and then we're going to close the poll. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right, end poll. Okay, we have 61.6% of you said false, and 38.3% of you said true, and the answer is false. So 2/3 of you were right. Very good. Um, most adult features are present as tiny cell clusters, even starting in the egg. And as the larva develops, these clusters grow and differentiate and then rearrange and develop further in the pupa stage. So we do get complete degeneration of some parts of the caterpillar, some of the muscles that are used to move the caterpillar that won't be needed in the pupa or the adult, so those degenerate and are replaced by new muscles that allow adult movement. So there was our little warm-up fun fact about monarchs, and we'll have a few other of these happening throughout. Okay, so we'll start with the complex life history of monarchs. And I'm getting, a lot of people are having, okay, it looks like most people's audio is loud and clear, so I'll just keep going here. Okay, so we're going to start with the annual cycle of monarchs. And starting with, we're going to go back in time about a month when monarchs were migrating south, and we're going to be focusing on the eastern half for the time being of this map of North America. Monarchs were coming from a broad area, funneling down through Texas, a very important state of Texas, into their overwintering sites in Mexico. We have a few dotted arrows on this map, so there's an arrow going into southern Florida, where some monarchs from the East Coast funnel into Florida instead of going towards Texas. We have a fairly distinct population in the western United States, although as you can see by the arrow coming down out of Arizona, that there is some genetic interchange between the monarchs in the western United States and the eastern migratory population. So these monarchs arrive in the overwintering sites usually late in October or very early in November and spend the whole winter, so their winter time is represented by the gold arrow on this map. So they spend the winter at overwintering sites in Mexico or along the coast in California for the western population. And then starting in mid-March, the population moves into the southeastern quarter of the United States. And the butterflies that overwintered in Mexico lay eggs in the southeastern United States, and then it's their offspring that move into the northeastern part of their range. So it's a two-generation return trip into the northern parts of the breeding range. And then we go through 2 to 3 non-migratory generations, and the final generation of the summer starts the cycle again, migrating back to the overwintering sites in California. Now, what's really unique and exciting about monarchs is that while they're at these overwintering sites in coastal California or in central Mexico, they're in fairly small areas, and we can count them. We can assess the size of the population every year. They all join together for us so that we can count them. And we can count them as they arrive in these overwintering sites, and we can count them at the end of the winter, so we basically can get a handle on how the population did during the previous summer and fall and how it did counting them during these 2 time periods. So this is a picture of this annual cycle of monarchs. We'll be focusing on the eastern migratory population, but I'd be happy to answer questions about the western migratory population if they come up, if I don't say enough about, because I see that there are people from California. So we can think about this cycle in pictures instead of just in a static map. So if we think about what monarchs need during these 4 phases of the cycle, migrating south, overwintering, migrating north, and breeding, as the monarchs are migrating south, they need nectar. They need to fuel that flight, and they actually gain weight as they're migrating because they nectar so much. So we have a monarch here nectaring on a fall plant. This is ironweed, which grows up here in Minnesota. They also need roosting spots, so this is a mesquite tree in Texas. The monarchs are clustering for the nighttime on this mesquite tree. When they get to the overwintering sites in Mexico, they need the right microclimatic conditions that allow them to survive throughout the whole winter. So we have a picture of monarchs clustering on one of the oyamel fir trees There is some flight that goes on, as you see in that picture on the left there, but for the most part, the monarchs are fairly sedentary during the winter time. And then as they leave these overwintering sites, they again need nectar to fuel their northern flight, and they also need milkweed. So here we have a picture of a female monarch that's laying eggs on some newly come up Asclepias viridis, and this picture was actually taken in Oklahoma. Monarchs are moving north, and when they get into their northern breeding range, again, they need nectar sources. So here we have a midsummer flower. This is a brown-eyed Susan in Minnesota, and they need milkweed to lay their eggs on and for the caterpillars to eat. And then the whole cycle starts again. So this is a cycle. That means that you can think of it as a chain, and every part of this chain is really important to the survival of monarchs. Any weak link can destroy the whole chain. But really, the basis of this chain is milkweed. So what we really need to provide for monarchs, especially during the summer breeding season when they go through these building generations, we need to make sure that there's plenty of milkweed available to them. And whenever I go to the overwintering sites in Mexico, I like to look at all of those butterflies and think that each one of them has a story, and each one of those stories begins on a milkweed plant. So that's what we need to do to support monarchs. Okay, so we're going to take a little bit of a break. We have kind of time built in because I can't see your faces and I can't see hands raising. So we have time for a few questions here. And if you have questions during my presentation, you can type them into this question and comments period. Wendy's, or into the stage down here, or into the box down here. Wendy's compiling these, but I see we have one question here, and I'll just answer. A couple questions have come in about milkweed. Do monarchs utilize all different kinds of milkweed? Are there some that they're drawn to more than others? So monarchs, because they cover such a large area, basically the same genes in monarchs find themselves in Texas, where very different species of milkweed are found than in the north. Monarchs do recognize many, many different species of milkweed. So they probably utilize species of milkweed that we haven't even tested. One of the resources that we'll share later has a list of the most commonly used species of milkweed in all different areas. But yes, they do recognize many, many different species of milkweed. And the kinds that are used, that they're more drawn to, really depends on where they are in the United States, where they are in this life cycle. Okay, so I'm going to move on. I see a lot of questions. We're not going to ever be able to get to all of the questions, but we do have a continuous record of all of these questions. So if there are things that don't get answered during my talk, we'll get back to those. Oh, I see one more. I'm a little reading these as they come on. I'm just going to answer the one that came in from Tim Matthews, the migration arrow going down into Florida. So that's a really interesting question. We know that some of the monarchs from the eastern migratory population do funnel down into Florida. So we see that. We can document that happening. We know that they join a continuously breeding population of monarchs in southern Florida. And the degree to which those monarchs re-migrate north and join the bigger part of the population isn't really understood. So it's kind of a mystery about the degree of interchange between the Florida population and the rest of the eastern migratory population. Okay, so we're going to go on now. I'm going to move away from the questions just so we get done in an hour, but again, we'll get to these questions and send answers to you somehow. So let's think about people's interest in monarch, and I think the fact that there are so many people on this webinar is a really good illustration of how people are really very interested in monarchs. And this interest goes back a long time. Butterflies in general and moths have been really important parts of ancient cultures of many different groups of people, and I'm highlighting here Mexico, Butterflies were observed by ancient Mexican cultures, the Teotihuacans. If any of you have been to the pyramids that were built, the Teotihuacan pyramids near Mexico City, you'll see a lot of butterfly motifs on those pyramids. More recently, the Cholutecs and the Aztecs. Butterflies represented fire and soul and death and warriors and travelers, many different things. So I've put images of two Aztec goddesses here on this slide. As many people know, they're a very important part of the Day of the Dead celebration. So we have a picture of a Day of the Dead symbol there. They're shown on the Michoacan license plate. That's the state in Mexico that most of the overwintering sites are in. And finally, monarchs are on the 50 peso banknote. So lots and lots of engagement with monarchs in Mexican culture. It's also true in the United States. So monarchs are the state insect or butterfly of 7 different states. You can identify yourself and be proud if you're from any of these states listed here: Alabama, Idaho, Illinois, Minnesota, Texas, Vermont, and West Virginia. Have all chosen monarchs, and I put the part of the state statute from Minnesota up here on the slide. But if you're not from one of these 7 states, you know if your state has a state insect or butterfly, and what is it? Might be interesting to hear about the state butterfly of other states of people that are represented here. So there also is interest in monarchs at very high levels in our government. This is a picture of Presidents Obama and Peña Nieto and Prime Minister Harper meeting in Toluca, Mexico last February. During this meeting, these 3 leaders of heads of state couldn't agree on trade, they couldn't agree on immigration, they couldn't agree on the disputed Keystone Pipeline, but they did agree to create a working group to study ways to protect the monarch butterfly. So that was a pretty proud moment for all of us when these to protect monarchs. And it really got a lot of energy around monarch conservation. So other things that people are doing to illustrate their interest in monarchs, they're very intensively monitored. Luckily, you're not all in a class I'm teaching right now, and I'm not going to give you a test on this slide. There's a lot of words on this slide, but the point is this is a long, long list of different programs that monitor monarchs. And you can see this is roughly the same diagram I showed when I was talking about the annual cycle. You can see that not only do we have a lot of programs, but we have people monitoring monarchs during every single stage of the monarch annual cycle. So if you're involved in any of these citizen science programs, thank you. I want to tell you that your data are very important in helping us understand what's going on with monarch populations. And just as an illustration, I have here something from the Journey North website. I'm going to let this cycle through a couple times. Each one of the dots on this map is a person reporting their first sighting of a monarch in the spring. So you can see the dates scrolling through in the upper right-hand corner of the map. And as this is happening, you can see that monarchs stop we have a couple weeks of holdup in the south while that first generation is coming back. So the kind of yellowish dots represent the population. So right now you're seeing the white dots, the yellow dots. These are the butterflies that have come back from Mexico. They kind of get holed up and then they just explode into the northern part of the breeding range. And then continue to move north and then start going through their 2 to 3 generations. So this is an example of what we can learn from citizen scientists. And you can imagine as we study this year after year, we can really learn a lot about how populations are changing, about the timing of the migration, the distance of the migration, and the number of monarchs that people observe. People also create monarch breeding habitat. So these are pictures of different kinds of habitats, and I've chosen them to represent a nature center up in the upper left, somebody's house, a home garden, a proud monarch way station owner in the lower left, and then we have a big CRP field or conservation reserve program field and some more natural habitat. So people are doing a lot to preserve habitat for monarchs. They're registering this habitat. There are over 9,000 registered monarch way stations. And we have a lot of people here who are monarch conservation specialists that are helping to get these registered way stations. People are involved in citizen science projects and labeling their habitat as MLMP sites. So here we have a site in Wisconsin that's a monarch larva monitoring project site. So lots and lots of examples of how people are doing what they can to help monarchs. Monarchs are also very important in a lot of different educational settings. So here we have pictures both in the United States and Mexico of children being involved with monarchs inside at a school, the picture of the school in Mexico, outside at a nature center in Georgia. I believe, yep, that picture was taken in Georgia of the 3 little girls. Kids outside looking at milkweed plants, and in Mexico learning how to monitor the overwintering sites in Mexico. So lots of use of monarchs in education, and I think that probably a lot of you that are listening today have raised monarchs in an educational setting, either as a student, if you're young enough, but probably a lot of you haven't been involved in educational activities with monarchs as educators. So that would be something you could share with each other as well. So this is something I think about a lot. I was trained as kind of a traditional ecologist, and it's kind of humbling to study this organism that people care so much. Most ecologists study things that only their mothers or grandmothers could really ever care about, but I study something that people really care about a lot. So I think a lot about why this is. And I think there are a lot of reasons. I think it would be good for everyone to kind of think about why monarchs resonate so much with them. I think one thing is that they're beautiful. Monarchs are beautiful as adults, like a lot of other butterflies are as well, but they're also beautiful as caterpillars and as pupae or chrysalids. So they have this real attraction with people because of their beauty. They're also very familiar. This is a picture of my daughter Amy when she was 2 or 1.5 or something. She's now 27. She's been looking at monarchs for a long time, but I think even if you're not the daughter of a monarch ecologist, you probably remember interactions with monarchs as a child, and that makes them very familiar to you. I see April remembers raising them in a classroom in 3rd grade. Monarchs are also incredibly interesting, which is why I started studying them. I've done a lot of experiments. These cages are experiments I've done looking at the reproductive behavior of monarchs, but we've learned about interactions between host plants and herbivores from monarchs. We've learned about insect migration, a lot about genetics and population structure. So we've really learned a lot of really key biological concepts from studying monarchs, and I think that's part of their attraction as well. Corinne says they don't bite or sting. Yes, definitely they don't. They're also really impressive. A monarch, and this is a fun, amazing fact, adult monarch weighs as much as a paperclip, the little old-fashioned kind of paperclip. And they can migrate 2 or maybe even 3,000 miles from their summer breeding grounds to overwintering sites in Mexico, and that's a really amazing feat. So these are some of the reasons that I've come up with talking to people, but I think it's something that it behooves us to think about. It's why monarchs are so interesting to people, because we can really build on the interest that people have in monarchs to engage them in interest in conservation in general. So I see monarchs as being a real flagship for conservation, and for some people it's kind of their first entry into really caring about the natural world. Somebody says no one's allergic to their fur, and I will say that during my very first summer of studying monarchs, Sarah, I did develop an allergy because I handled so many monarchs all day long and I was not careful about washing my hands, so I'd be handling monarchs and eating a sandwich at the same time. And I did develop a little bit of an allergy that year, so just a message that be careful if you handle them too much. Okay, so Wendy, we can take a little break now, and I've been answering a few, but are there questions that have scrolled by, Wendy, that you think I should answer at this point?
Sure. I'm trying to keep track of everybody's questions, but one stuck out to me in particular from John. He says the first sighting map shows a big difference between the western and the eastern populations, but does that reflect a real difference in population density or in reporting effort?
Oh, that's a really great question, John, and I'm glad we pulled back to that. So, and that's one thing about citizen science is we aren't doing random sampling. We aren't going out and sampling, you know, everywhere when we have citizens. So it's both. There is a lower density of people throughout much of where the western population is. So we don't have as many sightings because of that. But also the western population, I'm going to show you some numbers later, the western population is probably 1 or 2 orders of magnitude smaller than the eastern population. So it does reflect, as well as decreased lower density of people, it also reflects fewer monarchs in the West. So that's a really great question.
I'm going to jump back in, and Corinne reminded me to introduce myself. So for those of you that think I'm just a voice on the phone, my name is Wendy Caldwell, and I'm the coordinator of the Monarch Joint Venture. So that's why I'm interjecting.
Okay. Thanks, Wendy. Yeah, Wendy keeps a lot of monarch conservation going on in the United States. All right, so I'm going to move on to one more, or the second of our 3 fun facts. I'm kind of picking things that I hear a lot. So here's a true or false. Both monarch females and males migrate north from the Mexican wintering sites each spring. So we can say true or false to this one. You should say a poll up here. I'm going to give you a countdown. I'm going to start a countdown from 5 to 0, and we'll close the poll then. 5, 4. Oh, we have people being shy. 3, 2, 1, and poll. And here again, we have a lot of experts here. The answer is true. 87.5% of you said true. So we're going to go on. So actually, I read a lot in many different sources that only females migrate north. And people say, well, the males don't need to migrate north because their job can be done. They can get their mating done in the overwintering sites, and the females can fly north and not bother with the males anymore. But that's definitely not true. Both males and females, and probably our Texas people know that because they see the males coming north. Both of them migrate north. And I think probably the reason for this is not necessarily that it's that great for the whole population, but it's good for the males. It pays the males to stick with the females and just keep mating whenever they can find a willing female. And this is one of the first research projects that I did with monarchs way back in the 1980s. It turns out that we have what's called last male sperm precedence in monarchs. The last sperm in are the first ones that the female uses. So you don't want to be a male that mates with a female in Mexico, and if she mates again, she's going to use the second male sperm and not your sperm. So the females can store sperm. They keep the sperm inside an organ called a spermatheca, but it's to the male's advantage to keep mating with females. And I just wanted to just share a really exciting thing about monarchs. Actually, this is true of all butterflies, is that they actually have 2 kinds of sperm. So this picture that I put in the slide, this maybe is too much information here for you, but I'm going to share it. So these 3 things, these 3 kind of big things that look like worms in the picture of the sperm on the right are bundles of sperm. They're called eupyrene sperm. And each one of these bundles has 256 individual sperm cells in it. And if you're good at math, you know that 256 is 2 to the 8th power. So it's a result of 8 cell divisions that produce these 256 sperm that stay together, and as soon as, or very shortly after they get into the female, they spread apart into their 256 sperm and can be used by the female to fertilize eggs. And you can't see them that well in this slide, but there are a lot of other little lines in the slide, and those are sperm that are unique to butterflies and moths. They're called apirine sperm, and they don't have a nucleus, and their role isn't really understood that well. But it might be in sperm competition, so kind of fighting off the sperm from other males. So hopefully there are a few people out there that were interested in those fun facts about sperm. Okay, so back to monarchs and their numbers. Despite all of this interest that we've been talking about monarchs, monarch numbers are declining. So I'm going to show you a few graphs. This is a graph of the area that's covered. Remember I said that we can count the monarchs in Mexico and California. In Mexico, we use the area that monarchs occupy as a proxy for the number of monarchs that are found there. And you can see that the area occupied by the monarchs has been declining. For the first time, we had 4 years in a row with a continuous decline. Last year, it was as low as ever. We're hoping that that number, and we're quite sure that that number will be a little higher, but it's certainly not going to go back to the average of what it was before. So we're seeing a decline. So this is a reflection of a decline in the eastern migratory population. There's also a similar decline, although actually not as extreme over the last several years in the California population. So this graph actually has two different scales on it. The blue bars are the total number of monarchs reported, and they go with the numbers on the left side of the graph. So here you can see, at the very highest, there were maybe 1 million monarchs, kind of a little over 1 million monarchs, 1.2 million counted in the overwintering sites in California, more commonly, 500,000 or fewer, as opposed to maybe 500 million monarchs in the overwintering sites in Mexico. The orange line here is another way to look at the California population, the average number of monarchs per site. So you can see, again, that the numbers are going down in California, just like they're going down in Mexico, although not as extreme over the last few years. So because of this, several entities have named the monarch migration at risk. Just last year, or this year, it was named by the Endangered Species Coalition, put on the vanishing list. World Wildlife Fund named monarchs as one of their top 10 species to watch in 2010. And way back in 1983, the IUCN put the monarch migration on a list of what they called endangered phenomena. So it isn't that they didn't see the whole monarch population being in danger, but the monarch migration was listed as endangered in 1983. So what's going on? What are some of the reasons for this decline? And I'm going to start by saying that there are many different reasons for this decline. But probably the most important, most people would agree that the most important is habitat conversion or habitat loss. So here are just a few statistics for you. The United States is losing over 500 acres a day of land to real estate and energy development. So things like are in the top slide of development that probably used to be some open area not too long ago. In 2006 to 2011, more than 1 million acres of native prairie have been converted to cropland. That was published this year. And a lot of this land that we're losing used to contain milkweed and nectar plants. So that's actual habitat conversion. That's changing it from one use into another. And a lot of this is happening. This is a map from Monarch Watch that I've used a few other times, but I'm going to take a second to explain it now. A lot of this habitat loss is happening in an area that's very important to monarchs, and that's the Corn Belt. Let's see now, I think, let's see. Yeah, I hope you can see I'm putting a little green arrow here. So I'm circling the Corn Belt, which we know is the source of most of the monarchs that migrate to Mexico. So habitat loss in this area of the breeding range is particularly important to monarchs. And one thing that's happening in this area is that there are changing agricultural products that have meant that we're losing habitat even though the land is still used for the same thing. And in terms of humans, we're still using this land for corn and soybean production throughout the Corn Belt. But we did a study in 2000. Several people were involved in this study, and we estimated that because of the milkweed that's found in corn and soybean fields, so here's my fun little arrow again, you can see some milkweed here in this cornfield, and it's the milkweed growing in a soybean field and a monarch using that field. We did studies looking at the presence of milkweed in corn and soybean fields and assessing how much monarchs use this milkweed. We estimated that depending on which state we were in and how much land was devoted to agriculture, about 50 times more monarchs came out of ag fields than non-agricultural areas. And what happened to all of that milkweed is that it's disappeared because of the use of herbicide-tolerant crops. So this is a little sad milkweed plant. Here, I'm going to point it out. This is a milkweed plant that was growing in the soybean field. The farmer could spray this soybean field with Roundup because the soybean plants wouldn't be killed, but just the weeds would be killed. So we've lost all of that habitat that used to be used by monarchs. There are other herbicides. Well, starting next year, there will be other herbicides that plants will be resistant to, that crops will be resistant to as well, besides Roundup. But so far, what we've lost has been due to Roundup-ready crops, that kind of herbicide-tolerant crop. So you can see how herbicide-tolerant crop use has increased in the United States. You can see starting back in the late 90s, we had the use of herbicide-tolerant soybeans, so you can see that increasing over the course of the 2000s. We didn't have herbicide-tolerant corns until the mid-2000s. So when we did this study that I just talked about, that was in 2000, when there was no herbicide-tolerant corn, and a little less than half of the soybeans were herbicide-tolerant. So since then, most of the corn and most of the soybeans are herbicide-tolerant. So basically, milkweed is gone from almost all corn and soybean fields. So that's been a really important source of habitat loss for monarchs. We're also losing habitat in the overwintering sites. So in these photos taken by Lincoln Brower, you can see large trees are cut down in the overwintering sites. The trees are being cut down right where the monarchs overwinter. In the picture in the upper right, this area used to be, this is, for those of you that have been down there, this is Cerro Pelon. This used to be fairly important monarch area. You can see a lot of clearing taking place here. Now, most of this large-scale clearing has stopped, but there's still clearing on the smaller scale. So what we call ant logging or horse logging is still taking trees out of these overwintering sites in Mexico. But there are a lot of other factors. And, you know, we have people arguing that because habitat loss is so important, we really shouldn't concern ourselves with other factors. But really, a lot of these factors have the potential to become relatively more important as the population becomes smaller. So I'm just going to list a few of these things that also cause monarch mortality, that are known causes of monarch mortality, and things that we need to think about. So insecticides, people are really concerned about mosquitoes as disease vectors. And a lot of people don't know that adulticides or insecticides that are used to kill adult mosquitoes are not specific to mosquitoes. They kill all insects, including monarchs. So we did some research in our lab, and this kind of gruesome picture is a monarch caterpillar that was killed by milkweed plants that had been in an area where people sprayed an adulticide to kill adult mosquitoes. Climate change is an important factor. The picture taken here was taken in the overwintering sites after a storm in 2002 that knocked a lot of the monarchs out of the trees. That year, we lost, people estimate, up to 80% of the population in the overwintering sites due to a storm. And these kinds of storms are predicted to become more frequent under climate change scenarios. And certainly, climate change can affect monarch success in the breeding areas as well as the overwintering areas. Invasive species are another thing that people are concerned about. This picture is a swallowwort. It's in the genus Vincetoxicum. One of its common names is dog strangling vine, which I think is pretty an apt name. But what's scary about this plant is that it's related to milkweed. It's in the same subfamily, and it is attractive. Female monarchs perceive it as a host plant, so they lay their eggs on it, but the caterpillars can't develop. So this is something that we need to be concerned about. This is spreading. It started in the eastern United States. It's fairly common by now in Michigan. I've never seen it in Wisconsin or Minnesota, but it shows up on USDA maps. So that's another concern. People are concerned about collisions with vehicles during years that we have a lot of monarchs flying south, crossing these east-west highways that we have. You see a lot of car grills that look like the picture here. And finally, there's a disease that probably a lot of you have heard about called Ophiocystis electroscura, or OE for short. This is a debilitating parasite, and what this picture is, find my little arrow again. These are monarch scales from the abdomen of the monarch, but all of these little dots in here, the little things that look like footballs, are spores from this protozoan parasite. And we know that the incidence of this parasite is increasing. We don't know exactly why or what the effect on the population will be, but that's another thing we need to be concerned about. So lots of other things to think about when we think about monarch conservation. So I've been seeing a lot of questions coming up, but I've given up looking at them. So Wendy, do you want to throw in a few questions here?
I can try. I'm following along, but it seems like there's a lot of interest in questions about how the overwintering populations are measured, and is there a difference in the density of how those populations are measured over the year? For example, in Mexico, is the density changing from one year to the next, and is that being measured, and things like that?
Yeah, so that's a really great question too. Clearly, when we're measuring the area occupied, the number of monarchs per unit area can be variable. And that's a really difficult thing to get a handle on. So most of this counting is done by the World Wildlife Fund in Mexico. And they are measuring the population. They don't just count it once during the winter. They count it every 2 weeks or so. And they don't collect, just because it's pretty impossible to collect data on the density of monarchs. It's certainly something we think a lot about, but all we can do is use that size of the overwintering population as a proxy, knowing that it's not going to be, that the density of the monarchs isn't going to be exactly the same from year to year. And certainly the monarchs get less dense as the winter goes on, but they really do, when they first come to those overwintering sites, and when it's the coolest in late December and early January, when these numbers are collected, they are fairly dense. So we're fairly confident that the numbers are at least close to representing the size of the population. I saw a couple other questions, and we will provide, so the research on the mosquito sprays, just because people seem to know a little about mosquito sprays, those were done on pyrethroids, so which are, there are several different insecticides that are in the pyrethroid group, so that's what we did our studies on. And there have also been some research projects done on the impact of neonicotinoids. I saw discussion of that flashing up too. So really good discussion about insecticides. Thanks. Okay, we're going to have our last fun fact here. Probably anybody in here who has ever given a talk about monarchs has been asked about these gold spots. So here we have our chance to see what you know. Those gold spots are real gold. So we're going to do a countdown here. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And we have a few true answers here, so I'm going to end the poll. 95 false. They're not real gold. About 5% said they are real gold. The answer to this is pretty interesting. They're not metallic. They look metallic, and they reflect light just like metal does because of the way the layers of cells in the integument or the skin of the pupa are formed. So this gives them the appearance of being metallic because they reflect light. And what's very interesting is that all monarchs and their relatives, the Aldanaeinae, which used to be a family of monarchs, but now it's a subfamily, all of them have metallic coloring, at least somewhere on them. And this is, I think, the most beautiful. This is Euploea cor. This is a butterfly. The common name of it is the common crow butterfly. But I think it wins the prize for the most beautiful Danaid pupa. Hopefully you would agree with me. So all of the milkweed butterflies have metallic coloring somewhere, but they're not real gold. So that's good. So people aren't going to be harvesting them for gold. All right. So the last topic here is how should we respond to this problem with many causes? It's hard. It's hard to know what we can do about this problem that has a lot of causes. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my perspective as a conservation biologist. I think that we need to keep learning as much as we can about monarchs because good conservation requires good knowledge. So we need to continue to assess monarch populations. We can document their declines, but we can also document our successes. You know, something went right for monarchs this year. The numbers are probably going to go up, so we need to monitor them to be able to know what's going on. We need to know what factors affect monarch survival and movement and success. And we need to do all of this research in the context of understanding what might happen with climate change. But conservation, unlike some biological fields, also requires action. We need to address habitat loss. We need to make sure that nectar and milkweed resources are available for monarchs, that their overwintering sites continue to be available. Again, because I teach conservation biology, I think a lot about climate change. We need to plan for that. We need to continue to educate and advocate. And this is where all of you come in because you have huge audiences that you can reach. Tell them about what we can do about monarchs. And we need to support organizations that are working to preserve monarchs and pollinators. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Monarch Joint Venture. You can see all the lovely logos. And our newest member is the Green Schools Alliance. So it's great to see some people from the Green Schools Alliance way down there in the lower left-hand corner of our logo board. But many, many different organizations are part of the Monarch Joint Venture, working together on a collaborative U.S. effort on monarch conservation. All of the work of the Monarch Joint Venture is based on the North American Monarch Conservation Plan. That's available online in many different places, and I would recommend that people read it. It has a lot of great background on monarch biology as well as suggested conservation actions. The goals of the joint venture are habitat conservation, education and outreach, and research and monitoring. So we kind of have this three-pronged approach to monarch conservation. Really, all of our actions are that even if they're focused on monitoring and education, are dedicated to getting more habitat out there for monarchs. And this can include, the nice thing about monarchs is that they can live in habitats represented by all three of these pictures. So in beautiful pristine habitat along roadsides. Here you see monarchs on Liatris along a roadside and in schoolyards. This is a school in Rochester, Minnesota. So if we create habitat for monarchs, they'll find it in many different places. And our goal in all of these different kinds of habitat needs to be milkweed for the caterpillars and nectar sources for the adults, which can include milkweed, like you see in this picture, but can include lots of other flowers. We're also promoting research and monitoring because, like I just said, understanding and conserving monarchs requires a very broad temporal and spatial scale of data collection. So we can't just have a few scientists going out and collecting a little bit of data. We need people like this guy at the Cibolo Nature Center in Texas who are helping us understand what's going on with monarchs in his part of the world. And we need a variety of research approaches. So we're really promoting citizen science, and I see that we've been publishing some links to citizen science programs. We really encourage you to get involved with these. Lots and lots of education and outreach activities that we're doing. I'd like to just promote, we have a lot of fact sheets about monarchs, ideas of things that people can do to support monarchs. We promote workshops, and Kip Kiphart is in the audience, and that's a picture of Kip giving a talk to a group of people at Cibolo Nature Center, kids out in Duluth, Minnesota, western Minnesota, planting gardens, and this picture was taken in Georgia. So lots and lots of ways to involve many, many different audiences in monarch conservation. Fact sheets, I even reminded myself to say that. So I'm going to end with just a few slides about things that individuals and agencies and land managers can do. Again, habitat protection and management is really important. Oops, I'm missing a picture there. We need to protect and enhance the existing habitat that we have. And remember that that often includes management strategies. So that can include mowing or fire or herbicides or grazing. We can't just always let the habitat go on its own. We need to prevent invasive species and manage the habitat for monarchs. Whenever possible, we need to engage in adaptive management so that we see what works in our area and we do it. Habitat restoration should always include milkweed. So here we have pictures. I want to really emphasize the idea that there are many different species of milkweed. The Monarch Joint Venture has put together this map and recommended milkweed plants that can grow in all of these different regions of the United States. Here's a really great one on the bottom picture on the left there. Is a picture of a really cool milkweed plant that Don Davis and I saw a lot of in Arizona recently, Asclepias subulata, which hardly even looks like a cactus plant or something. So many, many different beautiful kinds of milkweed that you can grow. Again, educate and advocate. There are many things to do, just a few ideas up here. You can plant a monarch way station and register it with Monarch Watch. You can add your site to the Monarch Joint Venture. We have a success stories map on our website. You can talk to your friends and neighbors. You can ask local land managers to avoid mowing ditches when monarch eggs or larvae are present. So a lot of monarchs get wiped out by mowing machines as eggs or larvae when those ditches are mowed down. And I think it's important to think of all of the threats to monarchs, not just habitat. So we need to concentrate on habitat, but we need to think about all of those other threats as well. The pesticides, the climate change, disease, and things. And finally, get involved. Join a Monarch Citizen Science program and contribute data that will inform monarch conservation. Donating money. Lots of organizations are working on monarch conservation. The Monarch Butterfly Fund is a way that people in the United States can give money and have it be tax deductible to support conservation in Mexico. The Monarch Joint Venture, or really any organization out there that works on land preservation, restoration, or protection. Anything that you do to support all of these actions can support monarchs. So I just want to end by of realism. I think it's, but end with hope as well. We probably aren't going to see repeats of the large numbers that were coming a decade ago. I think it's unlikely that we're going to see 10 hectares of land occupied in Mexico. We've just lost too much land, at least under current agricultural practices. You know, we can argue that those agricultural practices aren't the greatest, but they're probably not going to change fast enough for monarchs. So we need to do what we can to replace as much of that habitat as possible, but we need to be realistic. We need to work to maintain public interest in monarchs. If people aren't seeing as many monarchs as they used to, monarchs might not be on the top of their brains. So we need to work to maintain that interest and ensure that this new normal, that this new number is sustainable. But I want to leave us with hope that we can, you know, monarchs can exist in a lot of different kinds of habitats. And our efforts will be worthwhile. Monarchs exist in this mosaic of rare and pristine, so virgin prairie, but they also can grow on milkweed plants that come up between the cracks in a sidewalk. And they share these habitats with many other species, so disturbed habitats, pristine habitats. They're incredibly interesting. We still have a lot to learn about the way the world works from monarchs. And their migration is an unmatched biological phenomenon. So this migration, this species is something that's really worth working hard on and saving. So I want to just end by saying thank you. Probably a lot of people in this audience can find themselves in some of these pictures. I stand on the shoulders of giants. I've worked with so many amazing people over my 30 years with Monarchs. And the pictures here represent my students and my Monarch Butterfly Fund and my Monarch Joint Venture colleagues. I'd really like to dedicate all of my monarch conservation work to citizen scientists, represented by this picture of my dad, who do so much work to conserve and understand monarchs. And finally, thank you to all of our colleagues. Most of you work for government agencies, Fish and Wildlife Service, and others. Thank you so much for what your agencies are doing to conserve monarchs and the natural resources that they and we depend on. So thanks to everyone.